The dust-coated stagecoach rattled to a stop outside Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1878, carrying Penelope Ward and her sleeping 4-year-old daughter, both of them looking like they'd been dragged through all 7 circles of hell. The driver helped Penelope down, handing her the small carpet bag that contained everything they owned in this world. Her face was pale beneath the grime of travel, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had nothing left to lose. Penelope clutched her daughter Emma tighter to her chest as she surveyed the small frontier town with uncertainty. The long journey west had depleted what little money she had, leaving her with barely enough for a night's lodging. She had fled Philadelphia with no plan beyond escape, no destination beyond away. Her husband's death from typhoid 6 months ago had revealed a mountain of gambling debts, creditors pounding at the door before he was even in the ground. When those same men began suggesting arrangements she might make to clear what her husband owed, Penelope had gathered her daughter and fled. Now, standing in the dusty main street of Silver Creek with her sleeping child, the reality of her situation settled on her shoulders like a physical weight. She had no money, no prospects, and no family to turn to. The burden of it nearly brought her to her knees. "Madam, you all right there?" A deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Penelope turned to find a tall man regarding her with kind eyes. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and he wore the practical clothing of a rancher, dusty denim, a faded shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded piercing blue eyes. Not the flashy attire of a gunslinger or saloon gambler, but the honest clothes of a working man. "Yes, thank you," she replied automatically, the social graces of her former life taking over despite her exhaustion. "Just getting my bearings." He nodded, his gaze moving from her face to the sleeping child in her arms. "Little one looks plumb tuckered out." "It's been a long journey," Penelope admitted. "Name's Keegan Walsh," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I own the Cross Creek Ranch outside of town." "You planning to stay in Silver Creek?" Penelope faltered, not knowing how to answer. She hadn't planned anything beyond escape. "I'm not certain yet," Keegan nodded, seeming to understand more than she'd said. "Town's got a decent boarding house. Mrs. Holloway runs it. Fair prices, clean rooms." "Thank you," Penelope said, adjusting Emma in her arms. The child was growing heavy and Penelope's arms ached from holding her. "Let me help you with that," Keegan offered, reaching for her bag. "Boarding house is just down the street. I can show you." Penelope hesitated only briefly before allowing him to take the carpet bag. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Walsh." "Just Keegan, madam," he said with a slight smile. "And you are Penelope Ward. This is my daughter, Emma." As they walked down the dusty street, Penelope felt the curious stares of townspeople. Silver Creek was small enough that a new face was noted, especially one arriving with a child and no husband in sight. "Not much to our town," Keegan said conversationally, "but decent enough folk for the most part. Got a general store, telegraph office, doctor who doubles as a dentist when needed, and the Silver Dollar Saloon, which I'd recommend avoiding." Penelope nodded, grateful for the information and the friendly guidance. When they reached the boarding house, a neat 2-story building with white curtains in the windows, Keegan set her bag down. "Mrs. Holloway's fair but runs a tight ship. No rowdiness tolerated," he said with a smile. "You'll be safe here." "Thank you, Mr. Keegan," Penelope corrected herself. "I appreciate your kindness to strangers." Something flickered in his eyes. "Everyone's a stranger until they're not. Silver Creek could use more decent folk." He tipped his hat again. "I'm in town most Saturdays for supplies. If you need anything before then, folks know where to find me." With that, he turned and walked away, his stride long and confident. Penelope watched him go for a moment before turning to face the boarding house, gathering her courage to start this new chapter of her life, however temporary it might be. Mrs. Holloway was a stout woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a no-nonsense demeanor that softened slightly at the sight of the sleeping child. She quoted a weekly rate that made Penelope's heart sink. Her meager funds would last perhaps 2 weeks at most. "I'll need to find work immediately," Penelope said, straightening her spine with determination. Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows rose. "Not much for a lady of your..." Background, she said, her gaze taking in Penelope's travel-worn but once fine clothing. Silver Creek ain't Philadelphia. Penelope blinked in surprise. How did your accent, dear, and that carpetbag has Eastern craftsmanship written all over it. Mrs. Holloway's expression softened further. Rest tonight. Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about work. Dr. Miller's wife might know of something suitable. In the small room upstairs, Penelope gently laid Emma on the narrow bed and unpacked their few belongings. Her wedding ring, the last item of value she possessed, caught the light from the window. She had kept it as a final resort, and it appeared that resort had arrived sooner than she'd hoped. Morning came with Emma's excited chatter as the child discovered their new surroundings. After a simple breakfast provided by Mrs. Holloway, Penelope set out to find work, Emma's small hand clutched in hers. The town was even smaller in daylight, a single main street with wooden boardwalks lining both sides, connecting the various businesses. Horses were tied to hitching posts, and wagons occasionally rolled past, stirring up dust that hung in the still morning air. Dr. Miller's wife, a kind woman with prematurely gray hair, listened sympathetically to Penelope's situation but had little to offer. The school needs a teacher, but the term doesn't start for months, she explained, and Barton's general store already has a clerk. By midday, Penelope's spirits had fallen considerably. No one seemed to need help, at least not the kind of help a genteel Eastern woman could provide. The saloon was hiring, but Mrs. Miller had pursed her lips at the mere suggestion, and Penelope couldn't imagine bringing Emma into such an environment. "Mama, I'm hungry," Emma said, tugging at Penelope's skirt as they left the mercantile. Penelope forced a smile. "Let's see what we can find, sweetheart." They purchased a simple lunch with their dwindling funds and sat on a bench outside the general store to eat. Emma, resilient as children often are, chatted happily about the horses and dogs she'd seen, while Penelope tried to hide her growing desperation. "Well, hello again," a familiar voice said. Penelope looked up to find Keegan Walsh standing before them, his hat in his hands. In the full light of day, she could see his features more clearly: the strong jawline, the slight crinkles around his eyes that spoke of laughter, and the golden brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Mr. Walsh," she greeted him, straightening her posture automatically. "Who are you?" Emma asked bluntly, studying the tall stranger with undisguised curiosity. "Emma," Penelope admonished gently. "Mind your manners," Keegan chuckled. "No harm done, madam. I'm Keegan Walsh, little miss. I own a ranch outside of town." Emma's eyes widened. "With horses and cows." "Horses and cattle, yes," he confirmed with a smile. "And a few chickens that think they own the place." Emma giggled, and Penelope felt a rush of gratitude for the man's easy way with her daughter. "Having any luck finding your bearings?" Keegan asked, his gaze shifting to Penelope. She hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "Not as such," she admitted finally. "It seems Silver Creek has little need for my particular skills." "What are those skills, if you don't mind me asking?" "I was a teacher before I married," Penelope said. "And I can keep accounts, write correspondence, play the piano." She trailed off, aware of how useless these accomplishments seemed in this frontier town. Keegan's expression turned thoughtful. "Actually, I might have a proposition for you, Mrs. Ward." "Miss," she corrected automatically. "I'm a widow," he nodded. "My apologies, Miss Ward. As I was saying, I find myself in need of help at the ranch. My housekeeper, Mrs. Gunderson, is getting on in years and could use assistance. And I've been meaning to find someone to teach my foreman's children, 3 of them, all school age but running wild with no education to speak of. Their mother passed last winter." Penelope stared at him, hope and wariness battling within her. "You're offering me employment." "Room and board for you and your daughter, plus a modest wage," Keegan said. "The ranch house is big enough that you'd have your own quarters. It's not fancy like you might be used to, but it's comfortable and safe." "Why would you do this?" Penelope asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Life had taught her that men rarely offered something for nothing. Keegan's expression turned serious. "Because those children need schooling, my housekeeper needs help, and you need work. Seems like a solution that benefits everyone." He paused. "I understand your caution, Miss Ward. Mrs. Gunderson is a respectable widow who's been with my family for 20 years. You can ask around town about me. I've no shortage of faults, but taking advantage of those in need isn't among them. Penelope studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. Finding none, she asked, "When would you need an answer?" "I'm heading back to the ranch tomorrow morning. Take the day to think on it and ask whatever questions you need to about me. If you decide to accept, be ready to leave by 8. After Keegan departed, Penelope spent the afternoon discreetly inquiring about him. The storekeeper, the doctor, even Mrs. Holloway all spoke well of Keegan Walsh. He'd inherited the ranch from his father 5 years earlier and had expanded it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. He was fair to his workers, paid his debts promptly, and while he wasn't a churchgoer, he contributed generously when the community had needs. Not married. Penelope asked Mrs. Holloway as casually as she could manage. The older woman gave her a knowing look. No, though not for lack of effort from every unmarried woman in 3 counties. Keeps to himself mostly, except for business. Decent sort, though. You could do worse. It's merely employment I'm considering, Penelope said primly. Mrs. Holloway's expression said she didn't believe that for a moment, but she simply nodded. Like I said, decent sort, and practical. Ranch that size needs a woman's touch. That night, as Emma slept, Penelope weighed her options. Remaining in town meant depleting her funds within weeks, with no guarantee of finding suitable work. Accepting Keegan's offer meant security for Emma, but also placing their futures in the hands of a man she barely knew, living isolated from town. In the end, practicality won out. By morning, Penelope had packed their meager belongings and paid Mrs. Holloway for their brief stay. At precisely 8 o'clock, she and Emma stood waiting outside the boarding house, their carpet bag at their feet. Keegan arrived driving a wagon, not the fine carriage Penelope had been accustomed to in Philadelphia, but a sturdy, well-maintained farm wagon with a fresh coat of green paint on its sides. He greeted them with a warm smile that reached his eyes. "You decided to take a chance on us," he said, helping Penelope into the wagon before lifting Emma up. "I decided to take a chance on providing for my daughter," Penelope corrected, though without rancor. Keegan's smile didn't falter. "Fair enough." The journey to Cross Creek Ranch took nearly 2 hours, during which Emma peppered Keegan with questions about everything from the horses pulling the wagon to the birds soaring overhead. He answered each query with patience, occasionally glancing at Penelope as if to gauge her reaction to his responses. As they crested a rise, Keegan pulled the wagon to a halt. "There it is," he said, gesturing ahead. Cross Creek Ranch, Penelope's breath caught. Below them stretched a verdant valley with a creek winding through it, the water glinting silver in the morning sun. Nestled against a backdrop of distant mountains was a sprawling ranch house of weathered wood and stone, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. It was beautiful in a rugged, untamed way that the manicured gardens of Philadelphia could never match. "It's like a picture book," Emma breathed, and Penelope silently agreed. As they approached, Penelope could see men working around the property mending fences, tending to horses, moving cattle from one pasture to another. The ranch was clearly a busy, productive operation. The house itself was larger than Penelope had expected, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. A gray-haired woman in an apron stood waiting, her hand shading her eyes as she watched their approach. "That's Mrs. Gunderson," Keegan explained. "Been with my family since before I was born. Makes the best apple pie you've ever tasted and doesn't tolerate foolishness of any kind." When they pulled up to the house, Mrs. Gunderson came forward to greet them, her sharp eyes taking in everything about Penelope and Emma. "So you're the school teacher," she said, her voice carrying a trace of Scandinavian accent. "About time these wild boys had some learning put in their heads." "Mrs. Gunderson, this is Miss Penelope Ward and her daughter, Emma," Keegan introduced them. "Miss Ward, Mrs. Helga Gunderson, without whom this ranch would have fallen to pieces years ago." The older woman snorted at this, but looked pleased nonetheless. "Come inside. You must be tired and hungry after the journey." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly refined. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and bookshelves filled with volumes that made Penelope's heart leap with joy. The floors were polished wood covered with colorful woven rugs, and the windows were large, allowing natural light to fill the space. "It's beautiful," Penelope said honestly. "My mother's influence," Keegan explained. "She always said just because we lived far from civilization didn't mean we had to live like savages. Mrs. Gunderson showed them to their quarters, a bedroom for Penelope with a smaller adjoining room for Emma, both simply but comfortably furnished. They shared a small sitting room that Mrs. Gunderson explained could serve as a schoolroom for the children. "The Holbrook children, that's our foreman's youngsters, will come up to the house for lessons," she explained. "Good children, just need a firm hand since their mother passed." After they had settled in and shared a hearty midday meal, Keegan offered to show them around the property. Emma was thrilled at the prospect and ran ahead as they left the house. Her earlier shyness completely vanished. "She adapts quickly," Keegan observed as they watched Emma chasing a butterfly across the yard. "Children are resilient," Penelope replied. "More so than adults, I think." "And you, Miss Ward, how are you adapting to the West?" Penelope considered the question. "It's different, rower somehow, less confined by social expectations." "That can be both blessing and curse," Keegan acknowledged. "Freedom comes with responsibility. Out here, a person's word and work define them more than their background or family connections." "A meritocracy of sorts." Keegan looked surprised at her use of the term, then smiled. "I suppose it is. Though nature plays no favorites, drought, blizzards, disease affect us all equally." As they walked, Keegan explained the workings of the ranch, the cattle operations, the horse breeding program he'd started. The crops they grew primarily to feed the livestock, but also to supply their own needs. Penelope listened attentively, asking questions that seemed to impress him with their practicality. They approached a corral where several cowboys were working with horses. One man, older than the others with a weathered face and a silver-streaked beard, broke away from the group and approached them. "Miss Ward, this is Frank Holbrook, my foreman," Keegan introduced them. "Frank, Miss Ward will be teaching your children and helping Mrs. Gunderson around the house." Frank removed his hat, revealing a balding head. "Mighty pleased to meet you, madam. Those youngsters of mine need schooling something fierce. Their mama would be turning in her grave to see how wild they've gotten." "I'll do my best with them, Mr. Holbrook," Penelope promised. "They're good kids at heart," Frank assured her. "Just been running a bit wild since Martha passed. Oldest boy's 12, then there's the twins boy and girl, they're 8. "When would you like me to start their lessons?" Penelope asked. Frank looked to Keegan, who answered, "Why don't we give you a few days to settle in and prepare? Monday would be soon enough to start formal lessons." As they continued their tour, Emma growing increasingly comfortable with both the surroundings and with Keegan, Penelope found herself studying their benefactor when he wasn't looking. There was a quiet strength about him, a confidence that came not from arrogance but from knowing his place in the world. He spoke to his workers with respect, listened to their concerns, and clearly commanded their loyalty in return. By the time they returned to the house, the sun was low in the sky, painting the valley in hues of gold and amber. Emma, exhausted from the excitement and fresh air, could barely keep her eyes open through supper. "I should get her to bed," Penelope said as Emma's head drooped for the third time. "Of course," Keegan agreed. "Tomorrow, if you'd like, I can show you where we keep the school books such as they are. You might want to review them before meeting your pupils." After putting Emma to bed, Penelope returned to her own room and stood by the window, looking out at the vast landscape now silvered by moonlight. The ranch was so different from the crowded streets of Philadelphia, the air cleaner, the silence broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle or the distant howl of a coyote. She had taken an enormous risk coming west, and another in accepting Keegan's offer. Yet standing there, breathing in the scent of sage and pine that drifted through the slightly open window, Penelope felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: hope. The next morning, Penelope woke to sunshine streaming through her window and the smell of coffee and bacon. Emma was already awake in her adjoining room, playing quietly with the rag doll that had been her constant companion since leaving Philadelphia. "Good morning, sweetheart," Penelope said, brushing Emma's dark curls from her forehead. "Did you sleep well?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I dreamed about horses, Mama. Can I see the horses again today? We'll have to ask Mr. Walsh, but I imagine that could be arranged." They dressed and made their way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Gunderson was bustling about preparing breakfast. The older woman greeted them with a nod. "Mr. Walsh is already out seeing to the cattle," she informed them. "He said to tell you the school books are in the cabinet in the study. You're to help yourself and let him know if you need anything else." After breakfast, Penelope explored the study, a cozy room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk of polished oak. The cabinet Mrs. Gunderson had mentioned contained an assortment of books, some clearly used as schoolbooks, others more general reading material. The collection was eclectic basic primers, mathematics texts, a worn copy of McGuffey's Reader, several volumes of history and natural science, and even some classics of literature. Penelope ran her fingers along the spines, pleased to find that while the selection was limited, it would be sufficient to begin educating the Hallbrook children. She was so engrossed in examining the books that she didn't hear Keegan enter until he spoke. "Find anything useful?" Penelope started, nearly dropping the volume of Shakespeare she'd been perusing. "Mr. Walsh, I didn't hear you come in." "Sorry to startle you," he said, looking genuinely contrite. "And please, it's Keegan. Mr. Walsh makes me look around for my father." Penelope smiled despite herself. "Keegan, then? Yes, there's quite a lot here to work with. These were your books," he nodded, coming to stand beside her at the cabinet. "Some of them. My mother taught me until I was 12, then I was sent east to school, Philadelphia, actually." "Really?" Penelope was surprised. "I wouldn't have guessed. 4 miserable years at Westfield Academy for Boys," Keegan said with a rueful smile. "I learned a great deal but never felt at home there, too much sky missing." Penelope found herself studying his face, trying to reconcile the rugged rancher before her with the image of a boy in an Eastern school uniform. "What brought you back west?" "My father's illness," Keegan replied, his expression growing more somber. "I was 19 when he took sick. By then I was at university, but I came home to help run the ranch, never went back." He shrugged slightly. "No regrets there. This is where I belong." There was something in his tone, a quiet certainty that Penelope envied. To know so clearly where one belonged in the world seemed a rare gift. "What about you?" Keegan asked. "What brought you all the way from Philadelphia to Wyoming Territory? If you don't mind my asking," he added hastily. Penelope hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "Circumstances," she said finally. "After my husband died, our financial situation became untenable. The West seemed to offer opportunities that the East did not." Keegan nodded, not pressing for details she wasn't ready to give. "The West is good for fresh starts," he said simply. "Speaking of which, I thought Emma might enjoy seeing the new foals this morning, if that's all right with you." Emma, who had been exploring the study with wide-eyed curiosity, perked up immediately at the mention of foals. "Can we, Mama, please?" "I wouldn't want to impose on your workday," Penelope began, but Keegan waved away her concern. "No imposition. I need to check on them anyway." The morning passed pleasantly as Keegan showed them the new foals, spindly-legged creatures that gamboled around their mothers in the corral. Emma was enchanted, and even Penelope found herself smiling at their antics. "Can I pet one?" Emma asked hopefully. Keegan looked to Penelope for permission, and when she nodded, he lifted Emma carefully over the fence and guided her toward the gentlest of the mares and her foal. "Move slow and quiet," he instructed. "Let them get used to your smell." Emma followed his directions perfectly, her small face solemn with concentration. When the foal finally stretched its neck to sniff her outstretched hand, then allowed her to stroke its velvety nose, the child's expression of wonder was something Penelope knew she would remember forever. "You're a natural with horses, Miss Emma," Keegan praised, and the little girl beamed with pride. Throughout the day, Penelope observed the interactions between her daughter and Keegan. The rancher showed infinite patience with Emma's questions and boundless enthusiasm, never once appearing annoyed or dismissive. For her part, Emma seemed to blossom under his attention, growing more confident by the hour. It was late afternoon when they finally returned to the house, Emma chattering excitedly about everything she'd seen. Mrs. Gunderson listened with feigned sternness that didn't quite hide her amusement. "Well, it sounds like you've had quite the adventure," the housekeeper said. "Now, would you like to help me make biscuits for supper?" Emma's eyes widened. "Can I, Mama, if Mrs. Gunderson doesn't mind," Penelope replied. "Child needs to learn useful skills," Mrs. Gunderson declared. "Never too early to start." As Emma followed the housekeeper into the kitchen, Penelope found herself alone with Keegan again. An awkward silence fell between them until he cleared his throat. "I should introduce you to the Holbrook children before Monday," he said. "Perhaps tomorrow. Their cabin is just down the hill from the main house." "That would be helpful," Penelope agreed. "I'd like to assess their current knowledge before planning lessons." Keegan nodded. "Frank's a good man, but since Martha died, he's been struggling. The children have had little guidance beyond what's needed to keep them fed and clothed. It's difficult for a man alone," Penelope said softly, thinking of her own challenges as a single parent. "Yes," Keegan agreed, his gaze meeting hers with unexpected intensity. "It is." The moment stretched between them, something unspoken passing in the air until Mrs. Gunderson called from the kitchen, breaking the spell. The following days established a routine. Mornings were spent preparing lessons for the Holbrook children, James, the serious 12-year-old, and the twins, Samuel and Sarah, who possessed identical mischievous grins and a talent for finishing each other's sentences. Afternoons, Penelope helped Mrs. Gunderson with household tasks, while Emma either napped or played in the fenced yard under the housekeeper's watchful eye. Keegan was often away during the days, tending to the various needs of the ranch, but he made a point of joining them for the evening meal, during which he would ask Emma about her day and discuss ranch matters with Mrs. Gunderson. Occasionally, he would engage Penelope in conversation about books they had both read or ask her opinion on some matter relating to the children's education. These conversations gradually extended beyond supper, with Keegan and Penelope often sitting on the porch after Emma was in bed, watching the stars emerge while discussing everything from literature to politics to the challenges of raising children. Penelope found herself looking forward to these quiet conversations, to the way Keegan listened so intently to her views, never dismissing them even when he disagreed. As weeks passed, Penelope settled into life at Cross Creek Ranch. The Holbrook children proved receptive to learning, though their education had been sorely neglected. James, in particular, showed a keen mind beneath his quiet exterior, devouring books on history and mathematics with surprising enthusiasm. Emma, too, was thriving. The pale, anxious child who had arrived in Silver Creek was transforming into a sun-browned, confident little girl who trailed after Mrs. Gunderson, helping with chores, and begged daily to visit the horses. "She has a way with animals," Keegan remarked one evening as they watched Emma from the porch. The child was carefully feeding carrots to a gentle old mare that Keegan had deemed safe for her to approach unsupervised. "Reminds me of myself at that age." "She's certainly taken to ranch life," Penelope agreed, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "I worried about bringing her west, about the hardships and dangers, but now I wonder if it wasn't the best thing I could have done for her." "Children adapt," Keegan said. "And there's a freedom here that city life doesn't offer." "Freedom, yes," Penelope mused. "Though I sometimes wonder what her future will be like growing up so far from." She trailed off, uncertain how to express her concerns. "From civilization," Keegan supplied with a hint of amusement. "The West is changing, Penelope. By the time Emma is grown, Silver Creek will likely have a proper school, perhaps even a college nearby. And there's value in knowing how to live close to the land, in understanding where food comes from and how to be self-sufficient." It was the first time he had used her given name, and Penelope found she liked the way it sounded in his deep voice. "You're right, of course. I suppose I still carry the prejudices of Eastern society with me." Natural enough, Keegan said easily. We're all shaped by where we come from. He paused, then added more softly, but we don't have to be limited by it. There was something in his tone that made Penelope turn to look at him. In the fading light, his profile was strong and clean against the backdrop of the mountains, his expression thoughtful as he watched Emma with the horse. No, Penelope agreed. We don't. As summer progressed into early autumn, the ranch became busier with preparations for winter. Hay was cut and stored, vegetables from the kitchen garden preserved, and cattle moved to lower pastures. Penelope found herself increasingly involved in these activities, learning skills she had never imagined needing in her previous life. Mrs. Gunderson proved a patient teacher, showing Penelope how to preserve fruits, make soap, and even basic veterinary care for the chickens and milk cows that provided for the ranch's immediate needs. The work was hard but satisfying in a way that needlepoint and piano practice had never been. "You're getting calluses," Keegan observed one evening, catching sight of Penelope's hands as she passed him a cup of coffee on the porch. Penelope instinctively closed her fingers, embarrassed by the roughness that had replaced her once soft skin. "I'm afraid my hands are no longer those of a lady." Keegan surprised her by gently taking her hand in his, turning it palm up to examine the calluses with a thoughtful expression. "These are the hands of a woman who isn't afraid of honest work," he said quietly. "There's beauty in that, Penelope." His touch sent an unexpected warmth through her, and she found herself unable to meet his gaze. "I should check on Emma," she murmured, withdrawing her hand and hurrying inside. That night, Penelope lay awake long after Emma had fallen asleep, her thoughts in turmoil. She had come to Cross Creek Ranch out of necessity, seeking safety and security for her daughter. She hadn't expected to find. What? Friendship, respect, the strange fluttering in her chest whenever Keegan looked at her with those intent blue eyes. "Don't be a fool," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "He offered you employment, not courtship." Yet as the days passed, Penelope found it increasingly difficult to ignore the growing connection between them. It wasn't just the conversations on the porch or the way he included her in decisions about the ranch. It was the small kindnesses, the books that appeared on her bedside table, chosen with obvious care to match her interests. The wild flowers Emma collected that mysteriously found their way into jars of water on the dining table. The way he always seemed to appear when a task was too heavy or too high for her to manage alone. Mrs. Gunderson noticed, of course. The housekeeper missed little that happened under her roof. "He's different since you came," she remarked one afternoon as they worked together kneading bread dough. "Smiles more, comes to the house for meals regular instead of eating with the men half the time." Penelope kept her eyes on the dough beneath her hands. "He's simply being kind to visitors." Mrs. Gunderson snorted. 3 months isn't visiting, it's living here. "And kindness doesn't make a man rearrange the furniture in his study, so there's better light for teaching, or ride 2 hours to Silver Creek to fetch special paper for a child's drawings." Penelope had no response to this. It was true that Keegan had gone out of his way to make them comfortable, to ensure that both she and Emma had what they needed, but that didn't necessarily mean. "He was engaged once," Mrs. Gunderson continued, her voice matter of fact as she shaped her dough into a loaf. 5 years ago. Girl from Denver, daughter of a business associate of his father's. Pretty thing, but city through and through. Despite herself, Penelope felt a sharp pang of something that might have been jealousy. "What happened? Winter happened," Mrs. Gunderson replied simply. She came to visit in October, all lace and fancy manners. By December, she'd had enough of the isolation and the cold, went back to Denver and married a banker. The older woman glanced at Penelope. "Broke his heart, I think, though he never said as much, been keeping to himself ever since." Until now, Penelope didn't know what to make of this information or why Mrs. Gunderson had chosen to share it. Before she could formulate a response, Emma burst into the kitchen, her face alight with excitement. "Mama, Mr. Keegan says there's going to be a harvest dance in town next weekend, and we're all invited. Can we go? Please?" Mrs. Gunderson raised an eyebrow at Penelope as if to say, "See what I mean," before turning her attention to her bread. "A dance," Penelope echoed, wiping flour from her hands. "Where is Mr. Walsh now?" "Right here," Keegan said, appearing in the doorway behind Emma. "Silver Creek holds a harvest dance every year, good opportunity for the community to come together before winter sets in." His gaze met Penelope's. "I thought you and Emma might enjoy a change of scenery." "Can we go, Mama?" Emma repeated, practically bouncing with anticipation. Penelope hesitated. She had nothing appropriate to wear to a social event, and the prospect of facing the curious stares of the townspeople was daunting. Yet Emma's eager expression was hard to resist. "I'm not sure, sweetheart. Let me think about it." Emma's face fell, but before she could protest, Keegan intervened. "There's still a week to decide," he said gently. "And if you choose to go, I'd be honored to escort you both." The idea of attending the dance as Keegan's guest sent a flutter through Penelope's stomach. "That's very kind of you," she managed. "Not kindness," he replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "My own selfish desire for your company." Before she could respond, he turned to Emma. "Now, Miss Emma, I believe I promised to show you how the blacksmith shoes a horse. Shall we?" As they departed, Emma chattering excitedly, Mrs. Gunderson gave Penelope a knowing look. "You'll need a dress," the housekeeper said simply, returning to her bread. The week leading up to the harvest dance passed in a flurry of activity. Once Penelope had agreed to attend, how could she refuse with both Emma and Keegan looking at her so hopefully? Mrs. Gunderson produced fabric from a trunk in her room. "Been saving this for something special," the older woman explained, unfolding a length of deep blue wool that had a soft sheen to it. "Not fancy by Eastern standards, but it'll make a fine dress for a country dance." Penelope was touched by the gesture. "I can't accept this, Mrs. Gunderson." "It's too generous." The housekeeper waved away her protest. "What am I going to do with it at my age? Make myself a burial shroud? Nonsense. The fabric wants using, and you want a dress." With Mrs. Gunderson's help, Penelope set about making a simple but elegant gown. Her sewing skills were adequate if not exceptional, and the older woman's experienced eye helped guide the process. For Emma, they refashioned one of Penelope's old skirts into a charming little dress with a matching ribbon for her hair. The night of the dance arrived clear and cool, with stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. Keegan had arranged for a wagon to take them to town, and as they set out, Penelope found herself unaccountably nervous. It would be the first time she had appeared publicly at Keegan's side, and she knew there would be speculation among the townspeople. "You look beautiful," Keegan said quietly as he helped her into the wagon. In the lantern light, his eyes were warm with admiration. Penelope felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. Mrs. Gunderson was very generous with the fabric." "It's not the fabric," Keegan replied with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. The town hall had been transformed for the occasion, with autumn leaves and dried corn stalks decorating the walls and lanterns casting a golden glow over the proceedings. A small band played lively tunes, and the dance floor was already crowded with couples when they arrived. Emma's eyes were wide with wonder at the decorations and music. "It's like a fairy tale," she breathed. "Indeed it is," Keegan agreed, winking at her. "And I believe every young lady at a ball deserves a treat." He produced a small bag of candied almonds, which Emma accepted with undisguised delight. "Don't eat them all at once," Penelope cautioned, but she was smiling at Keegan's thoughtfulness. As they made their way through the crowd, Penelope was conscious of the curious glances directed their way. Keegan seemed oblivious, greeting people with easy familiarity and introducing Penelope and Emma to those they hadn't yet met. "So this is the teacher we've been hearing about," said a well-dressed woman who was introduced as the wife of the bank manager. "Your students speak highly of you, Miss Ward." "That's kind of them," Penelope replied, pleased that the Hallbrook children had apparently mentioned their lessons to others. "Keegan was fortunate to find you," the woman continued, her gaze moving speculatively between them. "The ranch has needed a woman's touch since his mother passed." Before Penelope could respond to this rather pointed remark, Keegan placed a hand lightly at the small of her back. "Miss Ward is an excellent teacher," he said firmly. "The children are making remarkable progress under her guidance." The warmth of his hand through the fabric of her dress was distracting. and Penelope found herself struggling to maintain her composure as they continued through the crowd. Finally, they found a relatively quiet corner where Emma could watch the dancers without being jostled. "Would you care to dance?" Keegan asked, offering his hand to Penelope. She hesitated, glancing at Emma. "I shouldn't leave her alone." "I'll watch the little one," came Mrs. Gunderson's voice as the housekeeper appeared beside them. She had come to town earlier to visit a sister who lived near the church. "Go on now, dance while you're young enough to enjoy it." With a grateful smile, Penelope placed her hand in Keegan's and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. The band was playing a waltz, and as Keegan's arm encircled her waist, Penelope was acutely aware of their proximity. "I should warn you," she said, trying to mask her nervousness. "It's been some time since I've danced." "I'll lead," Keegan promised, his voice low near her ear. "Just follow me." And she did, finding to her surprise that they moved together with natural grace, as if they had danced together 100 times before. Keegan was a confident lead, guiding her through the turns and steps with a sure hand at her waist. "You dance very well for a rancher," Penelope observed, relaxing into the rhythm of the music. Keegan chuckled. Those miserable years at Westfield included dancing lessons. The headmaster believed every gentleman should know how to waltz. "I'm beginning to think those years weren't entirely wasted then," Penelope teased. "Perhaps not," Keegan conceded with a smile that made her pulse quicken. "Though I never imagined I'd be grateful for them until this moment." The intensity in his gaze made Penelope glance away, suddenly shy. "People are watching us," she murmured. "Let them," Keegan replied simply. "I'm not concerned with their opinions." "Perhaps you should be," Penelope said, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "I'm your employee, Keegan. There will be talk." "There's always talk in a small town," he said dismissively. "But if it bothers you." He drew back slightly, putting a more proper distance between them while maintaining the dance frame. Penelope immediately missed the warmth of his closeness but knew it was for the best. As the music ended, Keegan escorted her back to where Mrs. Gunderson sat with Emma, who was happily watching the dancers while munching on her candied almonds. The evening progressed pleasantly, with Keegan dancing once with Emma, lifting the delighted child to stand on his boots as he guided her around the floor. Penelope accepted a dance with Frank Holbrook and another with the town doctor, but found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Keegan as he moved through the crowd, his tall figure easy to distinguish among the townspeople. It was late when they finally headed back to the ranch, Emma fast asleep in the wagon bed on a nest of blankets Mrs. Gunderson had thoughtfully brought along. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead, and Penelope found herself drawing her shawl tighter against the chill. Without a word, Keegan removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders. The heavy wool held his warmth and scent leather, pine, and something indefinably masculine. "You'll be cold," Penelope protested. "I'm used to it," he replied. "Wyoming winters toughen a man's hide." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horses' hooves on the packed dirt road. "Did you enjoy the dance?" Keegan asked finally. "Very much," Penelope admitted. It was good to see Emma so happy. "She's had little enough joy in her short life." Keegan glanced at the sleeping child. "She's a remarkable girl, resilient, like her mother." Penelope shook her head slightly. "I'm not sure resilience is the right word, desperate perhaps. When one has a child depending on them, there's little choice but to keep moving forward." "You could have remarried in Philadelphia," Keegan observed. "Found another husband to provide for you both." The suggestion brought a bitter taste to Penelope's mouth. The men who showed interest after William died were either attracted to what they believed was my fortune, which was non-existent, or... She trailed off, unwilling to speak of the crude propositions she had received from her late husband's creditors. Keegan seemed to understand what she left unsaid. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That was presumptuous of me." "No," Penelope sighed. "It's a logical question. The truth is, I couldn't bear the thought of binding myself to another man like William, charming on the surface but selfish and irresponsible beneath, and the alternatives seemed worse." "What was he like?" Keegan asked. "Your husband." Penelope was silent for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. No one had asked her about William since his death, except to offer platitudes about what a fine man he had been. Platitudes she had accepted with a fixed smile, knowing the truth was far more complicated. He was handsome, she said finally, charming when he wanted to be. The son of one of Philadelphia's oldest families, though the fortune was mostly gone by the time I met him. I was 20, teaching at a girls' school, and he swept me off my feet with poetry and promises. She paused, remembering the whirlwind courtship that had seemed so romantic at the time. We were married within 3 months of meeting. By the time I realized who he truly was, the gambling, the drinking, the endless schemes that never quite materialized into success, I was already with child. Emma, Keegan said softly. Penelope nodded. He was delighted to have a daughter, another pretty possession to show off, but he had little interest in the day-to-day responsibilities of fatherhood or husbandhood for that matter. She sighed. I don't mean to speak ill of the dead. William wasn't cruel, just selfish, childish, really. Always chasing the next excitement, the next opportunity, without thought for the consequences. And when he died, Keegan asked gently, the creditors descended like vultures, Penelope said, her voice hardening at the memory. Everything of value was sold to pay his debts, but it wasn't enough. Some of the men he owed suggested arrangements that might clear the remaining balance. Keegan's hands tightened on the reins, but his voice remained calm. So you left. So I left, Penelope confirmed. With Emma and what little I could carry, heading west where no one knew us or could find us. I had this notion that I would find work in Denver, perhaps as a teacher, but my funds ran out in Silver Creek. And here you are, Keegan said. Here I am, Penelope agreed, glancing at him in the moonlight. Thanks to your generosity. Keegan shook his head slightly. Not generosity. The ranch needed what you provide: education for the children, help for Mrs. Gunderson. He paused, then added more softly, and perhaps I needed what you provide as well. Which is? Penelope asked, her heart suddenly beating faster. Keegan's gaze met hers, his eyes silver in the moonlight. Conversation. Companionship. The sound of a child's laughter in a house that's been too quiet for too long. Before Penelope could respond, the wagon crested the final hill, bringing the ranch house into view, its windows glowing with the lamps Mrs. Gunderson had left burning to guide their return. Home, Keegan said simply, and Penelope found herself wondering when she had begun to think of Cross Creek Ranch in those terms. The days following the harvest dance brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere at the ranch. Nothing was said explicitly, but Penelope was aware of a new tension between herself and Keegan, not unpleasant, but charged with unspoken possibilities. Their evening conversations on the porch continued, but now there were moments when their hands would brush accidentally, or their eyes would meet over Emma's head at the supper table, and Penelope would feel a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire in the hearth. Mrs. Gunderson observed all with knowing eyes, but made no comment beyond occasionally finding reasons to take Emma with her on errands, leaving Penelope and Keegan alone in the house. The first snow fell in early November, transforming the landscape overnight into a glistening white expanse. Emma woke Penelope at dawn, her small face pressed to the window in wonder. Mama, the whole world is white. After breakfast, Keegan showed them how to dress properly for the cold layers of wool and leather, scarves wound high around their necks and sturdy boots that Mrs. Gunderson had somehow procured in exactly the right sizes for both Penelope and Emma. Can't have you freezing before Christmas, the housekeeper said gruffly when Penelope tried to thank her. Outside, the air was crisp and clean, the snow crunching beneath their boots as Keegan led them around the ranch. The cattle had been moved to sheltered pastures, the horses brought into the barn where they stood in comfortable stalls, their breath forming small clouds in the cool air. Emma was enchanted by everything: the way her footprints showed behind her, the icicles hanging from the eaves, the red berries on the holly bushes near the house standing out like drops of blood against the snow. I've never seen her so happy, Penelope remarked to Keegan as they watched Emma attempting to build a snowman with Mrs. Gunderson's somewhat bemused assistance. Children thrive on freedom and fresh air, Keegan replied. And security, he added, glancing at Penelope. Knowing they're safe and cared for. Yes, Penelope agreed softly. That above all. Later, as they warmed themselves by the fire with cups of hot cider, Emma fell asleep on the rug, exhausted from her adventures in the snow. Penelope watched her daughter's peaceful face, heart full of gratitude for how far they had come from those desperate days in Philadelphia. "What are you thinking?" Keegan asked, his voice low so as not to wake the child. Penelope looked up to find him watching her, his expression open and curious. "I was thinking about how much has changed in 6 months," she admitted. "How close we came to a very different fate." Keegan's face sobered. "I'm glad you found your way here," he said simply. "As am I," Penelope replied, "though I sometimes wonder how long it can last." "What do you mean?" Penelope hesitated, uncertain how to express the nagging worry that had been growing in her mind. "Winter will pass, spring will come, the Hallbrook children will eventually learn what I have to teach them, and then what becomes of us?" Keegan set his cup aside and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Is that what's been troubling you, the future? Isn't that what troubles everyone?" Penelope asked with a slight smile, "the uncertainty of what lies ahead." "Some uncertainties can be resolved," Keegan said carefully, his gaze steady on hers, "if one is brave enough to ask the right questions." Penelope's heart began to beat faster. "What questions would those be?" Keegan took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "Penelope, these past months with you and Emma here have been, I've never—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm not good with words, not like this." "Just say what's in your heart," Penelope encouraged softly. "You," he said simply. "You and Emma." "That's what's in my heart." He reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "I know it hasn't been long, and you have every reason to be cautious after your experience with William, but I care for you, Penelope, deeply, and for Emma too." Penelope felt tears prick at her eyes. "Keegan, I'm not asking for an answer now," he continued quickly. "Just think about staying, not as my employee but as—" He faltered, then steadied himself. "As my wife, if that's something you might consider in time." The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Penelope looked at their joined hands, then at Emma sleeping peacefully on the rug, and finally at Keegan's face open, honest, and more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I would need time," she said finally. "Not because I don't care for you, I do, more than I thought possible after William, but marriage is." She trailed off, searching for the right words. "A partnership," Keegan supplied, "or it should be, equal voices, equal respect." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm not William, Penelope. I don't want a pretty possession or someone to run my household. I want a companion, a partner, someone to share the good days and weather the bad ones with." "And Emma?" Penelope asked, though she already knew the answer from the way he treated her daughter. Keegan's expression softened as he glanced at the sleeping child. "Emma is part of you," he said simply. "Loving you means loving her too, and that's not difficult. She's a remarkable child." Tears spilled over onto Penelope's cheeks then, the emotion of the moment overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. "I never expected this," she whispered. "When I came west, I was just trying to survive to keep Emma safe. I never thought I would find home," Keegan suggested gently. "Yes," Penelope nodded. "Home and someone to share it with." Keegan reached up to brush away a tear from her cheek, his touch tender. "Is that a yes, then? You'll consider it?" "It's more than that," Penelope said, finding her courage. "It's a yes, I will marry you when the time is right." The joy that spread across Keegan's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Penelope responded, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek as the kiss deepened, becoming a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Keegan rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "Both of you." "And we love you," Penelope replied, knowing it was true. Somehow, in the midst of hardship and uncertainty, she had found not just safety but joy, not just security but love. On the rug, Emma stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Mama, Mr. Keegan, why are you sitting so close?" "And why are you crying?" Penelope laughed, wiping away the last of her tears. Happy tears, sweetheart. Come here. Emma climbed into her lap, looking curiously between the two adults. Are you sad? She asked Keegan, noticing his intense expression. No, Emma, he replied with a smile. I'm happier than I've ever been, because I've asked your mother a very important question and she said yes. Emma's brow furrowed in confusion. What question? Penelope smoothed her daughter's hair. Mr. Keegan has asked if we would like to stay here at the ranch permanently, as his family. Emma's eyes widened. Family, like, you would be my papa. Keegan's voice was husky with emotion when he answered. If you would like that, Emma, I would be honored to be your papa. Emma considered this solemnly for a moment, then broke into a brilliant smile. I would like that very much. And Mama would be your wife, like in the stories. Exactly like in the stories, Keegan confirmed, his gaze meeting Penelope's over the child's head. With a wedding and everything, Emma pressed, growing more excited. With a wedding and everything, Penelope agreed. When the snow melts and spring comes, and we'll live happily ever after, Emma asked, her young face earnest and hopeful. Keegan reached out to include both Penelope and Emma in his embrace. We'll build our happily ever after together, he promised, day by day. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the love of this man who had opened his home and his heart to them, Penelope knew that the desperate journey west had led her exactly where she needed to be. Not to a place, but to people, to family, to home. The winter passed in a whirl of activity as Penelope, Emma, and Keegan settled into their new dynamic as a family to be. Christmas was celebrated with a simplicity that nonetheless felt more joyous than any elaborate Philadelphia holiday Penelope could remember. Mrs. Gunderson outdid herself with the feast, and Keegan surprised both Penelope and Emma with thoughtfully chosen gifts: a beautiful leather-bound journal for Penelope, and a hand-carved wooden horse for Emma that looked remarkably like the filly she had befriended. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Frank Holbrook was the first to congratulate them, followed by a steady stream of ranch hands and townspeople who found reasons to visit Cross Creek throughout the winter months. Most seemed genuinely pleased, though Penelope noticed a few disappointed looks from young women who had apparently harbored hopes regarding the eligible rancher. As the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Mrs. Gunderson took charge with unexpected enthusiasm, ordering fabric from Denver for Penelope's wedding dress and planning a feast that would feed half the territory. Nothing fancy, she insisted when Penelope tried to temper her plans. But proper, a wedding should be proper. Emma was beside herself with excitement, especially when Keegan formally asked her to be part of the ceremony. Every bride needs a flower girl, he explained seriously. Someone to scatter rose petals for her to walk on. The child took this responsibility with utmost seriousness, practicing her petal scattering technique daily, until Mrs. Gunderson finally had to banish her from the kitchen where the dried rose petals were being stored. As the wedding day approached, Penelope found moments of quiet reflection amid the preparations. One evening, she stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in hues of gold and pink, thinking of how far she had come from those desperate days in Philadelphia. "Penny for your thoughts," Keegan said, coming to stand beside her. Penelope smiled at the endearment he had begun using in private. "They're worth at least a nickel," she teased. "Highway robbery," he complained good-naturedly, slipping an arm around her waist, "but I'll pay it gladly." Penelope leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid warmth of him. "I was just thinking about how life can change so completely in the space of a year. Last spring, I was a desperate widow with no prospects and a child to feed, and now," Keegan prompted when she fell silent. "Now I'm about to marry a man I love deeply in a place that feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived," Penelope finished, turning to face him. "It seems almost unreal sometimes." Keegan's expression grew serious. "Do you ever regret it, coming west, all you left behind?" Penelope considered the question honestly. "I miss certain things," she admitted. "Books, music, the convenience of city life. But no, I don't regret it. What I've found here, what we've found together, is worth far more than what I left behind." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed created specifically for new beginnings. The ceremony was to be held on the ranch, under a bower of early blooming wildflowers that Keegan and his men had constructed near the creek that gave the ranch its name. In the bedroom that would soon be hers to share with Keegan, Penelope stood still as Mrs. Gunderson made final adjustments to her dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "You look beautiful, Mama," Emma said from her perch on the bed, already dressed in her own finery, a pale blue dress with ribbons in her dark curls. "Beautiful indeed," Mrs. Gunderson agreed gruffly, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "He won't know what hit him." A knock at the door announced the arrival of Frank Holbrook, who had agreed to escort Penelope to the ceremony in the absence of any family to give her away. "Ready, Miss Ward?" he asked, his weather-beaten face softened by a rare smile. "Everyone's waiting, and the boss is wearing a path in the grass with his pacing." "I'm ready," Penelope said, and was surprised to realize it was entirely true. There were no last-minute doubts, no hesitation, just a calm certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Emma went first, scattering rose petals with careful precision down the path to where Keegan waited beside the minister, who had ridden out from Silver Creek for the occasion. The assembled guests, ranch hands, townspeople, and a few of Keegan's business associates from as far away as Denver smiled at the child's serious expression as she completed her important task. Then it was Penelope's turn. With Frank at her side, she walked the petal-strewn path toward her future. Keegan stood tall and handsome in a new suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his eyes never leaving her face as she approached. The love in his gaze was so palpable it brought tears to her eyes. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged simple vows and rings, a plain gold band for Keegan, and for Penelope, a delicate circle of gold set with a small but perfect diamond that had belonged to Keegan's mother. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Keegan's kiss was gentle but held the promise of deeper passion to come. The assembled guests cheered, and Emma rushed forward to be included in their embrace, which Keegan gladly extended to include her. "We're a family now," Emma declared happily. "Really and truly." "Really and truly," Keegan agreed, lifting the child into his arms while keeping his other arm around Penelope. "Forever and always." The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and drink flowing freely, music provided by several ranch hands who proved surprisingly talented with fiddle and guitar, and dancing under the stars as lanterns illuminated the yard. Finally, as the hour grew late, Keegan and Penelope bid their guests good night. Mrs. Gunderson had already taken a sleepy Emma to bed in what was now officially her room, no longer the guest room, but a permanent part of her life. Alone at last in the bedroom that was now theirs, Penelope felt a momentary shyness overcome her. Keegan seemed to sense her nervousness and made no move to rush her, instead taking her hands in his. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Penelope asked, surprised. "For bringing light back into this house, for trusting me with your future and Emma's, for making me happier than I ever thought possible." Penelope felt tears threatening again. She had cried more today than in the entire year prior, it seemed. "And thank you," she replied softly, "for giving us a home when we needed one most, for loving Emma as your own, for being the kind of man I can trust with my heart." Keegan raised a hand to cup her cheek. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of that trust," he promised. Then, with a slightly mischievous smile, he added, "Starting now." His kiss was different this time, deeper, more urgent, expressing all the desire he had kept carefully banked during their courtship. Penelope responded in kind, allowing herself to feel fully the passion she had denied for so long. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Penelope's head resting on Keegan's chest, his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear, she found herself thinking again of the journey that had brought her here. From desperate flight to newfound happiness, from uncertainty to security, from loneliness to love. "What are you thinking about, wife?" Keegan asked, his voice a deep rumble beneath her cheek. Penelope smiled at the still new term. "I was thinking that sometimes the end of one path is just the beginning of another, better one," Keegan's arms tightened around her. "And our path is just beginning." "Yes," Penelope agreed, settling more comfortably against him. "Our path is just beginning." Epilogue: 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on Cross Creek Ranch, turning the surrounding hills golden and warming the breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers through the open windows of the expanded ranch house. On the wide front porch, Penelope sat in a rocking chair, a book open in her lap, though her attention was focused on the scene before her rather than the words on the page. In the yard, Keegan was teaching 9-year-old Emma to throw a lasso, the child's face a study in concentration as she attempted to capture the wooden practice post. Nearby, 3-year-old William toddled after a butterfly, his chubby legs carrying him in determined pursuit, while 1-year-old Catherine sat in a wooden playpen, contentedly stacking and knocking down blocks under the watchful eye of Mrs. Gunderson, who refused to retire despite Keegan and Penelope's insistence that she had earned her rest. The ranch had prospered in the 5 years since their marriage. Keegan's innovative breeding program had produced horses that were sought after throughout the territory, and his cattle operation had expanded significantly. The original ranch house had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family, with a dedicated schoolroom where Penelope now taught not only the Hallbrook children but several others from neighboring ranches. Silver Creek, too, had grown. The railroad had finally reached the town 2 years earlier, bringing with it new businesses and residents. There was a proper school now, where Penelope taught 3 days a week, and a small library that she had helped establish with books donated from as far away as San Francisco and Chicago. Emma had blossomed into a confident young girl with her mother's intelligence and her adoptive father's love of the land. She rode as well as any ranch hand and read voraciously from the ever-expanding library, but her greatest joy was helping Keegan with the horses. He had given her a filly of her own on her 8th birthday, and the two were inseparable. William, named for Keegan's father, was a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful nature. Already he followed Keegan around the ranch whenever allowed, solemnly observing the work and occasionally offering his toddler assistance, which was always accepted with appropriate seriousness. Baby Catherine, named for Keegan's mother, had arrived just over a year ago, completing their family in ways Penelope hadn't known were missing. She was a sunny child with Keegan's golden brown hair and a smile that could charm the sourest disposition. "Mama, I did it." Emma's triumphant cry drew Penelope's attention back to the lasso lesson. The loop had indeed settled around the post, and Emma was jumping up and down in excitement while Keegan beamed with pride. "Well done," Penelope called back. "Your father is an excellent teacher." "And you're a natural, Em," Keegan praised, ruffling the girl's dark curls. "A few more years and you'll be out roping me." Emma glowed under the compliment. From the very beginning, Keegan had treated her as his own, legally adopting her shortly after their marriage. Emma had taken to calling him Papa almost immediately, and the bond between them had only strengthened with time. Penelope watched as Keegan scooped up William, who had abandoned his butterfly chase to see what all the excitement was about, and swung the boy onto his shoulders. With Emma skipping alongside, they made their way back to the porch. "Your daughter," Keegan announced with mock seriousness, "is going to put all my ranch hands to shame before she's 12. "I'm not surprised," Penelope replied, setting aside her book to accept William as Keegan transferred the boy to her lap. "She has an excellent teacher." Keegan leaned down to kiss her, a gesture that still sent a pleasant warmth through her even after 5 years of marriage. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his hand gently touching her slightly rounded belly. "Wonderful," Penelope assured him. Though her previous pregnancies had been relatively easy, Keegan still worried, especially as this one had come as something of a surprise. "Doctor Miller says everything is progressing perfectly." "Good," Keegan said, relief evident in his voice. He turned to Mrs. Gunderson, who was approaching with Catherine in her arms. "And how's our little princess today?" "Busy," the housekeeper replied dryly, transferring the baby to her father's waiting arms. "Building and destroying with equal enthusiasm, Like her father with ranch projects, Keegan laughed, accepting the gentle ribbing with good humor. His latest project was a new barn, larger than the original, and designed to accommodate the growing horse breeding operation. Creation requires destruction sometimes, he defended himself. Isn't that right, Katie girl? The baby gurgled happily in response, patting her father's cheek with a chubby hand. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they moved inside for the evening meal. The dining table, once too large for just Keegan and Mrs. Gunderson, was now filled with family Keegan at one end, Penelope at the other, the children between them, and Mrs. Gunderson in what had become her customary place at Penelope's right hand. The conversation flowed easily. Emma's excitement about her lassoing success, William's earnest account of the butterfly that got away, Mrs. Gunderson's update on the progress of her vegetable garden. Keegan shared news from town about the planned expansion of the school, and the possibility of a regular stage line now that the railroad had increased travel to the area. After the meal, once the younger children were bathed and in bed, Emma had her special time with both parents reading together in the study, taking turns with the book Keegan had ordered specially from Denver, a lavishly illustrated edition of Black Beauty that combined Emma's love of horses with her enjoyment of reading. Later, when Emma too had been tucked in for the night, Penelope and Keegan retreated to the porch for their own private time, a tradition they had maintained throughout their marriage, regardless of how busy or tired they might be. Do you remember our first conversations out here? Keegan asked as they settled into the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. Of course, Penelope replied with a smile. You were trying so hard to be proper and professional while also finding excuses to spend time with me, Keegan chuckled. Was I that transparent? Completely, Penelope assured him. Though I was trying equally hard to convince myself I wasn't falling in love with you. And how did that work out for you? He teased, pressing a kiss to her temple. About as well as your attempts at professional distance, she replied, turning her face up for a proper kiss which he gladly provided. When they parted, Keegan's expression grew more thoughtful. Do you ever miss it, your life back east? It was a question he had asked before, usually after they received letters from Penelope's one remaining connection to Philadelphia, a former teaching colleague who occasionally sent news of the city and its inhabitants. Not for a moment, Penelope answered honestly. Everything I need is right here, and it was true. The desperate young widow who had stepped off a stagecoach in Silver Creek with nothing but a carpet bag and a child was gone, replaced by a woman who had found not just security but joy, not just a home but a family, not just a protector but a partner. I love you, Penny, Keegan said softly, his hand finding hers and twining their fingers together. More than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Penelope replied, leaning into his embrace as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Cross Creek Ranch, more with each passing day. As the evening deepened around them, Penelope reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the fear and uncertainty that had driven her west, the chance meeting with a kind-eyed rancher, the risk she had taken in accepting his offer, and the love that had grown between them, strong and enduring as the mountains that watched over their valley. She had come with a child and no future until a cowboy said, "Let me give you both one." And he had given them that and so much more: a home, a family, a love that would last all the days of their lives.